Hi everyone, RJ Stansberry here with another little screencast. This time I wanted to take a look a bit at the ancient Near East in connection with this Western civilization course that we are working through over the next few weeks. The Hebrews of all of the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, the Hebrews I think represent one of the most important cultures of the ancient Near East, particularly as they relate to the subsequent history of Western civilization. The Hebrews, of course, are the foundation textually, culturally, ethically to the Christian religion, which crops up in the period of the Roman Empire. And so they have a profound influence, really, on the West, like no other ancient Near Eastern civilization truly does. The Hebrews are also important because they give us a bit of a microcosm of what other ancient Near Eastern civilizations look like, particularly more important, as it were, ancient Near Eastern civilizations, the Persians, for example, or Egypt, which truly were gigantic and very powerful and influential civilizations in their own right. The Hebrews, of course, are a smaller, less significant in terms of politics and whatnot, but their culture and their civilization does give us a microcosm. For example, they had kings just like other ancient Near Eastern civilizations did, and they also wrote down their histories in the form of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. Just like other civilizations, the Babylonians, the Sumerians also tended to write down their histories and their stories about the beginnings of their civilization. They did this largely for posterity. So a lot of these ancient Near Eastern civilizations have some elements to them, some characteristics to them that they share. And so while the Hebrews may not be on the same level politically as the Assyrians or the Persians or the Egyptians, certainly they were influential in terms of Western civilization, largely because of their religion. So I wanted to take a look at this very briefly with you. First of all, as you can see here from this slide, the ancient Israel, the ancient Hebrews were situated along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, which really was an important highway, if you will, between some really significant cultures, Assyria in the north and Egypt in the south. And so this chunk of land always became a really important piece of property politically, militarily, for a number of different reasons. They also were important because I think Israel, along with ancient Greece and the Phoenicians, they represented kind of an Eastern Mediterranean culture that we always need to keep in mind when we're thinking about some of these early civilizations, including even the Greeks. We'll get to the Greeks next week, but when we teach this stuff and read about this stuff, we tend to split these civilizations up into separate groups. But we need to appreciate that a lot of what's going on in the ancient world is happening on the highway, as it were, of the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. And so Israel was definitely part of that culture. So it's important to remember, their geography and how significant they were in terms of that. And as I mentioned earlier, they did write down their laws, their customs, their beliefs in the form of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we're most familiar with these texts, perhaps more so than we are with ancient Babylonian texts or Sumerian texts. But the idea is the same. They wrote these texts to preserve their history, to preserve their laws, to preserve their customs, and to hand these customs and whatnot down through successive generations. So they, like many other civilizations, used writing to help preserve their culture. And that's an important aspect of civilization. In the first chapter of Spielvogel talks about some of the characteristics of a civilization, and writing down these texts, these stories, in some ways these mythic tales, is an important characteristic of these civilizations. And the book of Genesis and Exodus and so forth, these are certainly familiar to us. They're great stories about the creation of the world and the early patriarchs and the story of Genesis flood and whatnot. These are the kinds of stories that we tell to our kids and to our grandkids. And every civilization had those kinds of what we might call mythic tales that help to preserve and help to pass on cultural values and to successive generations. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can look at the Hebrews from a couple of different ways. You can look at them from their political history, and you can talk about David and Solomon and all of the various kings and whatnot of the ancient Hebrews. And their political history is interesting, of course. It's recorded for us in books like the Kings and Chronicles of the Old Testament. But from a political standpoint, the Hebrews were not terribly important, as it were. The really important cultures in this era are, of course, the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and people like that. But the Hebrews, what makes them so important, as I said, was their religious history. And so I think if we're going to spend any time looking at the ancient Hebrews, it's really important that we understand something about their religious history. And what I wanted to do here in just a few minutes is kind of walk you through some of the basics about Hebrew religion, just so that we can have a sense of what some of the characteristics of this religion, what those characteristics are. Now, again, Spielvogel talks about some of these. I just want to highlight a few of them as we go on. I suppose the first thing I'd mention here is that Hebrew religion was initially henotheistic. And what we mean by that is that the ancient Hebrews certainly believed in the existence of their God, Yahweh, or Jehovah, as it's sometimes referred to, but they also believed in the existence of other, what we might call lesser gods. And you see this in a number of different ways. You see this, for example, even in the book of Genesis with the creation story. You see this in the battles between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, where the prophets of Yahweh challenged the prophets of Baal to a test. In other words, they believe that their God is the superior God, but they also believe that there are these lesser powers. And it's not unlike maybe even what you see among the Greeks or the Romans that have their sort of chief gods, the Zeus, if you will, and then also some of these less significant deities or powers. So this seems to be, most scholars, when they're looking at early Hebrew religion, they tend to look at it through the lens of henotheism, as opposed to the sort of radical monotheism that you tend to see later on in the prophetic books, for example. So by the time you get to the prophets of Isaiah, and Ezekiel, and Daniel, etc., you tend to see a view about monotheism that is strict, it's ethical, it's absolute, and these other so-called ancient Near Eastern deities really don't even exist, or at worst they're some sort of demonic characters of some sort. But early on, there does seem to be this kind of competitive element to Hebrew religion. Let me just give you one little illustration of this. In the book of Genesis, of course, it talks about the creation narrative that we're also familiar with. In this creation narrative, as you know, God creates ex nihilo. He creates out of nothing. And this is a really important point, because if you look at other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, and there are quite a few of these, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, but if you look at these other stories, there's often a lot of chaos involved in the creation narratives of the ancient Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Hittites or the Sumerians. A lot of chaos in the creation story. Even the creation stories of the ancient Greeks, you see this kind of chaos. And I think in part what the writers of Genesis were trying to do in their story about creation was to communicate to the world that, our God, the God that we call Yahweh, is really a superior God. He doesn't create out of chaos. He creates out of nothing. He speaks and the stars come into existence. He speaks and the land separates from the water. He speaks and doggies and kitty cats and birds and all of the reptiles come into existence. He speaks and the plants come into existence. And of course he speaks, and the creation of human beings is also something that does not involve chaos, as what you see in other ancient Near Eastern civilizations. So even in the creation story itself, these mythic tales about the beginnings of the world, the beginnings of humanity, even here you see ancient Israel presenting something of an apologetic for their God. Okay? So I think that's one of the important points to take away from Hebrew religion. Another thing, of course, is ancient Israel's emphasis on the covenant that these people made with their God Yahweh. And again, you see this covenant illustrated in the Old Testament. You see it carried all the way through to the New Testament, where Jesus himself initiates a new covenant. But the covenant is pretty simple. It's a covenant, it's an agreement, if you will, between God and his people, the ancient Israelites. And the agreement goes something like this. If you keep my commands and my precepts, and you do the things that I tell you to do, in all of these various books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and these law books of the Old Testament, if you keep my commandments, I will bless you. That's the deal. And if you don't keep those blessings, if you don't keep those commandments, you will be cursed. And you think about it a little bit, these blessings and cursings go along several different lines. For example, if you keep my covenant and you keep my laws, Yahweh says, I will give you land. I will give you the land flowing with milk and honey. I will give you the land of ancient Israel. If you disobey my commandments and my laws, I will send you into captivity. And of course, the Israelites went into captivity both by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians as punishment for their disobedience. So this idea of inheriting land is something that's an important element of the covenant. Another aspect of this covenant has to do with the blessings and cursings related to food. If you think about it, again, God says to the ancient Israelites, if you keep my commandments, I will feed you, I will provide you. This notion of milk and honey in the promised land. Probably the best example of this, of course, is when Israel is wandering in the wilderness after their delivery from the land of Egypt, and God provides them with manna from heaven and quail, and he feeds his people. He promises sustenance to his people. And likewise, if the people of God refuse to follow God's commands, he curses them with famine. And some very famous famines occur in the land of Israel where people are essentially starving. So that's another element. A third element to the blessings and cursings of all of this might have to do with the way God promises successive generations. So he makes the promise to Abraham, for example, that your descendants will be like the sands of the seashore. This is a really important point, that keeping God's covenant, keeping his blessings, will result in fertility. And so that's a thing. And then likewise, failing to keep his covenant will result in the women of ancient Israel being barren, being without child. And of course, you remember this. If you've read it all in the Old Testament, you know many of the wives of the great patriarchs were very stressed about whether or not they were going to have a child. I'm thinking here primarily of someone like Sarah, Abraham's wife. The whole point of having a child was really something that was significant for these ancient Israelites. A couple of other things that were associated with this covenant had to do with the victory over enemies. Keep my covenant and I will make you victors over your enemies. And if you fail to keep my covenant, you will lose battles. So that's another element of this. And you know, what's fascinating, and this is just a little side note here, but one of the fascinating things about this notion of the covenant is this carries over into the New Testament covenant that Jesus makes with his new people, his new Israel, if you will. And again, just to give you a couple quick examples of this, Jesus promises that If you keep the covenant, you will inherit not land, but him. He becomes the fulfillment of the land promises of the Old Testament. Or same thing with regard to the food promises, that while the ancient Israelites were fed manna from heaven in the wilderness, Jesus promises to feed his people with his body and blood. It's really interesting when you think about it, how Jesus, when he institutes this new covenant, seems to fulfill a lot of these covenant blessings, fulfill them with his own person, with his own self. So anyway, the covenant is a really important aspect of Hebrew religion. Also, of course, the law of Moses is a significant, really significant part of ancient Hebrew religion. Several of the books of the Pentateuch are filled with laws that are required and expected by the people of God to keep. The book of Leviticus, of course, Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments, of course, being the basis of the Old Testament law. And you can compare this again to other ancient Near Eastern law codes, most famously the Code of Hammurabi, and see a lot of parallels, again, a lot of parallels between other ancient Near Eastern law codes and the code that you see in the Old Testament. A couple of other things I just mentioned here briefly. Hebrew religion was also a religion of prophets. Now, the Hebrews weren't the only people to have prophets in terms of their religion. Most other ancient Near Eastern religions also had prophets as well. But this is something that's really important, and the prophets are very critical of religious leaders. They're critical of hypocrisy. They're really an important aspect of Hebrew religion. And you can see this, of course, in some of the Old Testament books that are written by prophets, from Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel to some of the minor prophets near the end of the Old Testament. This was a central aspect of Hebrew religion. I mentioned earlier the ethical monotheism that you see, particularly in the latter part of ancient Israel's history. This is something that becomes much more absolute and more serious as Israel's history proceeds. And finally, I'd also mention the both universalist and separatist idea of Hebrew religion. And this is something that's applicable to Christianity as well, but it's important to remember this when God makes his covenant with Abraham. He says that these blessings and this covenant is going to extend to other nations, something the Apostle Paul picks up, I believe, in the book of Galatians when he talks about this in relation to Jesus and the new covenant. It is universal. It is really for everyone. Yet at the same time, there's also a separatist mentality within Hebrew religion. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. Remember, the ancient Israelites were told not to mix with other nations, and you see this all the way throughout their history, that they're supposed to stay separate, that they're supposed to stay pure. Their cult, their religious worship is centered around a temple that's very exclusive. So there's both this universal aspect to Hebrew religion, and there's kind of a separatist mentality as well to Hebrew religion, something that, as I said, transfers into Christianity as well, which is also both a universal religion and a separatist religion in both ways. So those are some of the characteristics of Hebrew religion that I think are really important for us to appreciate as we look at all the various things with regard to the ancient Near East. Hebrew religion is probably one of the most important things. And finally, I just remind us here that Hebrew religion was very, very successful. When you think about Hebrew religion, it influenced many of the world's most prominent religions right to this day. Of course, Judaism is the Hebrew religion, but also Christianity and Islam, two other very significant and very influential world religions, are all ultimately from Hebrew religion. So when you think about it in terms of the world population, I don't know that there are that many people, that there are any people anymore who worship the sun god Ra or Isis or Zeus, or any of these other ancient Near Eastern deities. Baal, for example, or Marduk would be other examples. If you want to find these ancient Near Eastern deities, the best place to find them is in a museum. If you want to see images of Baal, if you want to see images of Marduk, you're not going to find a community in the world today that worships Baal, but you will find them tucked away in a museum someplace. Hebrew religion, on the other hand, is celebrated by and practiced by the majority of the world's population right to this day. When you think about it in terms of Israel, of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So whatever that means, and it could mean a number of different things. This could be an apologetic, if you will, for the reality of the Hebrew God, Yahweh. But whatever you want to say about this, Hebrew religion was extremely, extremely successful, and it remains successful even to this day. So I hope that helps a little bit. Just wanted to take a few minutes and highlight a few of the key aspects of Hebrew religion as we work through some of the material in the ancient Near East. If you have any questions or comments about any of this stuff, please feel free to post them on the discussion forum. And I look forward to chatting with you more about some of this stuff online. All right, great. I hope you have a wonderful day and a great weekend.